Women, Men, and the Changing Role of Gender in Immigration. A South Bend Reality. Over the past few decades, Latino immigrants, primarily of Mexican descent, have been immigrating to the United States at increasing rates in search of economic opportunities that are not readily available in Mexico and Central America. The west side of South Bend has witnessed this rapid influx of Mexican immigrants, causing a shift in the demographic composition of the community. Over a period of 10 years, South Bend's Latino population increased from 3% of the total population in 1990 to 8% of the total population in 2000. Given the rapid growth of the Mexican population in South Bend, it is essential that a more comprehensive understanding of this group be developed. Gender is a useful lens for examination of the Latino population in South Bend. Why is gender important? Gender is a sociocultural construct of female and male identity that shapes how individuals live and interpret the world around them. Gender is not natural. It is learned in society through direct and indirect means. Although some may think that gender mainly applies to women, gender refers equally to ideas about females and males. Gender thus refers to the social attributes, opportunities, and relationships that are associated with being feminine and masculine. It also determines what behaviors are valued, expected, and allowed of men and women in a given context. Similarly, gender roles are perceived behavioral norms associated with males and females within a given social group, culture, or system. Moreover, the ideas of masculinity and femininity exist only in comparative relation to one another. In other words, femininity does not exist independently of masculinity and vice versa. Gender affects and is affected by social, political, economic, and religious forces. Migration represents a drastic life change, and gender roles and relations often shift in this process. At the same time, gender permeates many of the practices, identities, and institutions involved in the processes of immigration and assimilation. The goal of this research brief is to gain a better understanding of the gender roles of Mexican immigrants and how they are influenced by the migratory process and life in South Bend and elsewhere in the United States. This research addresses what Sotelo, a pioneer in the study of gender and immigration, refers to as the third stage of immigration research. This brief examines a breadth of issues related to gender, including traditional gender roles in Mexico, spatial embodiment of gender roles, social networks, labor markets, and sexuality. Traditional roles in Mexico. The meanings of gender are learned and internalized through everyday life. Children come to understand what masculinity and femininity means through seemingly inconsequential practices. The spatial organization of residences is one example of an ordinary practice that deeply affects how gender is learned by young children. Gender roles of men and women are reflected in spatial distinctions of the street and the home. Men are able to leave the home freely, whether it be for work or leisure, because part of their gender role is to support the family. They are not required to ask for permission to be in the street. Symbolically, la calle represents men's space. It implies freedom for working and even for reprehensible behavior, such as drinking and infidelity. A blind eye is turned to these behaviors because men provide the financial support for a household. On the contrary, la casa symbolizes a female space. The home tends to be a space of ordered and managed sexuality as opposed to sexual danger and ferment of the street. Women are largely expected to be homemakers, ensuring that the home and children are adequately cared for while men work outside of the home. There are not many opportunities for women to work outside of the home, and women can be chastised if seen outside the home without a man. As a result of these heavily gendered identities, marriages are often based on the concept of respect and have a hierarchical power structure in which a woman is often relegated to the demands and desires of her husband. Both men and women we interviewed in South Bend who migrated from Mexico attested to this spatial arrangement being the standard. They explained that a woman's primary role in Mexico is to obey her husband and her family while caring for the home and children. This embodiment of la calle and la casa reflects the traditional gender roles that have defined men's and women's identities in the past. These traditional roles were largely based on families marrying families for economic or status reasons, rather than a man and a woman marrying for passionate love. However, several important processes are shaking up the social and familial structures that define these spatial distinctions. For example, migration has profoundly affected gender roles and identities. Anthropologist Roger Rouse studied a transnational migrant circuit linking Anguilla, Michoacan, and California's Silicon Valley. He explains that it is a circuit as a whole, rather than any one locale, that constitutes the principal setting in relation to which Aguillans orchestrate their lives. Thus, transnationalism is a useful framework when trying to understand the changing gender roles and gendered identities both in Mexico and the United States. Modern definitions of gender roles also stem from the global media. The internet and television provide constant images of the modern world, influencing the way of life in Mexico. Additionally, these roles change through time, both generally speaking and through one's lifetime. Men and women have more authority as they age, as is typical in many societies. Additionally, when men migrate to the United States and leave their wives in Mexico, women gain much more autonomy and power as they make important familial decisions independently. With all of these dynamic factors, gender roles and identities in Mexico have modernized to become different, lived reality for men and women alike. Although much of the traditional gender roles and spatial images remain prevalent in Mexico, immigration has shifted many of these norms over the past few decades. The modern influence from immigrants in the United States has motivated individuals in Mexico to change their behavior. For example, many women in Mexico are beginning to work outside of the home for wages, often selling foodstuffs or other items in the informal economy, because their women counterparts in the United States are working outside the home. Not only is this becoming acceptable in some places, it is expected behavior in efforts to become more modern, as Mexicans consider the United States as the standard for modernity. Relatively speaking, this is a newer trend. In the 1970s, women's participation in the Mexican labor market increased by 50%. Participation accelerated even more in the 1980s during the economic crisis and subsequent structural readjustment programs. Therefore, the younger generation of women is working outside of the home much more than older women ever did, as this becomes the new standard. Many marriages can now be defined by trust rather than respect. In these relationships, love and respect are often reciprocated, leading to a mutual trust and intimacy of a pair. Much of this confianza stems from an increasing amount of people marrying based on love and choosing their own partners. Overall, migration has affected the traditional gender roles in Mexico, transforming them into what families in Mexico believe is the norm in the United States. Families try to conform to what is modern based on what they gather from their transnational relationships with family and friends in the United States. Women's changing role in the United States. Because many migrants come to the United States for economic reasons, more women are inclined to enter the labor force to increase family income. In doing so, gender roles and power structures often transform in the United States. By entering the workforce, women gain leverage in their families because of their increased economic influence. This is not to say that women do not work outside of the home in Mexico, as that certainly is the case for many women. However, much of the work that women do in the United States generates more income than it would in Mexico, allowing women to be much more financially independent. Patricia Pizar, an anthropologist who is an expert on Dominican immigration, has concluded that labor has distinct effects on Dominican women's identities. Work enhances women's self-esteem as wives and mothers, affords them income to actualize these roles more fully, and provides them with a heightened leverage to participate equally with men in household decision-making. Since Mexican women come from a culture that has similar patriarchal norms of machismo, this finding is significant for Mexican women as well. Sotelo also notes research conducted in Mexican immigrant communities in the U.S. suggests that the increase in immigrant women's economic contribution to the family economy, concomitant with immigrant men's declining economic resources, accounts for the diminution of male dominance in immigrant families. While many of the men and women we interviewed acknowledged that women have more power in the United States, many of these power relations hinge upon domestic violence, as they did in Mexico. Many of the women stated that they felt more powerful in the United States because there were laws to protect them against domestic violence, but also stated that abuse and violence were regular occurrences, so that men continued to run the home because of violence. Therefore, although many women and men believe that women have gained power in the United States, there is still the consensus that men use abuse and violence as tools to oppress them. The role of domestic violence is somewhat paradoxical. Although women and men believe that one of the reasons that they have more power is due to the domestic violence laws that protect women, both sexes also assert that domestic violence is a prevalent way through which men continue to mandar la casa, illustrating that the situation in the United States is not completely different from that in Mexico. However, most women that were interviewed felt positively about the shift in gender and power roles that have occurred in the United States, indicating that they preferred their role in the U.S. The progress of women's shifting gender roles could also be seen through a generational lens. Some individuals mentioned that their mothers received the same treatment in the United States as they did in Mexico. They were abused and were not able to stand up for themselves because they were unable to read, to write, or to drive, limiting their independence. On the other side of the spectrum was Samuel, the 11-year-old son of second-generation immigrants, who insisted that he would never, ever hit his wife. The range of beliefs about the role and treatment of women illustrates the ideological shifts that take place over time as a result of migration to the United States. Overall, there are notable differences in the roles of women in Mexico and the United States. As a result of the labor opportunities outside the home and domestic violence laws, women feel more empowered than they did in Mexico. The effects of this empowerment creates a ripple effect, influencing a multitude of social aspects. As Pesar notes, despite gender inequities in the labor market and workplace, immigrant women employed in the United States generally gain greater personal autonomy and independence, whereas men lose ground. It also provides them with greater leverage in appeals for male assistance in daily chores. Spatial mobility and their access to valuable social and economic resources beyond the domestic sphere also expand. Social networks, power, and relationships. Social networks are essential for the participation of all people in communities, especially in immigrant communities. Roger Rouse explains how migration has always had the potential to challenge established spatial images. It highlights the social nature of space as something created and reproduced through collective human agency. These social spaces hold the potential for social networks. The fact that social networks are dynamic is a given in changing social spaces. Social networks, however, cannot be discussed without a gendered lens. When one leaves their entire social network in their home community and begins a new life in a new place, social networks must be refound and often rebuilt. Social networks take various forms and serve various functions for both men and women. Jennifer Hirsch, in her ethnography, A Courtship After Marriage, describes one of the most obvious and useful roles of social networks. She explains that for migrants to the United States, it is comforting to know that they belong to a social network at home, reminding them that in Mexico they are valued members of a community in spite of the fact that they work in low-paying, low-status jobs here in the United States. In South Bend, we see the same emphasis, but on social networks back home. These networks back home, as women and men in South Bend have recounted, are based primarily on family and extended family. Additionally, for practicality's sake, they expand and are more flexible here in the United States. There is equal value in belonging to a social network in the United States, specifically in South Bend. Many women, upon arriving in South Bend, feel more isolated from social networks, of which they were a part of at home. Trust is essential to rebuilding social networks in South Bend. One informant, Jocelyn, described to us that she finally found power in her relationship with her husband and as a woman in the United States when she found the social network that supported her. We found as well that women who claimed they felt more power in their relationships often had trust as opposed to respect, not only with their husband, as Hirsch talks about, but also with a larger social network. Immigrant men are assumed to be the main participants in transnational social networks. They are presumably the bridge between the home community and the new community in the United States. While men certainly do allow for the continuation of transnational social networks, women also play into these networks. They also must participate in social networks in South Bend to build trust with others. Pires Sotelo explains the purpose social networks for men. Reduce migration's financial and social costs and risks by providing the new migrant with valuable information, cash loans, job contracts, and other resources. Women in South Bend claim that they are able to transform abusive relationships and gain power as individuals outside the house through networks. They gain power when they learn how to drive, form relationships with other women, and work outside the home. All three steps to gaining power and dignity as a woman take place when the woman leaves the realm of the domestic, private sphere. When she leaves this realm, she is able to build a social network with those in her community and those in her workplace. One woman, Bertha, currently living in El Paso, neither fully in the United States nor quite detached from Mexico, explained almost longingly of the social network she had in the factories in Juarez. She told us of how she missed the days they spent together in the same unfortunate situation, but with the support of each other. Men in South Bend expressed to us their concerns at first in letting their female partners leave the private sphere. Since men normally are the pioneers of public social networks, it's difficult for them to accept that women too can and should build and maintain them. Hence, it seems their masculinity is threatened when women begin to form their own social networks. When they begin to be supported by other women, rather than just their fathers or husbands, they take on some of the traditional male roles. Jocelyn and Antonio expressed to us the threat to the husband's power caused when Jocelyn left the house. He would go to all extremes, even locking her inside the home and beating her daily, to assure that he would not lose power as the one in the dominant position who belonged to a stronger social network. Interestingly, as the wife in this relationship has built a network outside of the home, in her workplace, with other women in her church, her husband has stopped abusing her. He has gained trust in her, and she in him. It seems, then, that the construction of social networks outside the home in South Bend are essential for both men and women. They serve both practical and emotional purposes. In the wider social network, the more trust each has in others in public, the more trust they find in each other in their relationship. Both gain power through the building and joining of social networks. Changes in labor in Mexico and the U.S. There is a common misconception that Mexican women never work outside of the home until they reach the United States and are thus liberated from the bondage of home life. This generalization is far from the truth. In fact, in the 1970s, women's participation in the Mexican labor market increased by 50% and accelerated even more in the 1980s during the economic crisis and subsequent structural readjustment programs. Women of all educational levels began working in the formal and non-formal sector in increasing numbers as they began having fewer children and becoming mothers later in life. In fact, with the increase in migration to the United States, women's employment in Mexico has become a symbol of the ever-elusive progress many Mexicans seek on the road to modernity. This dynamic situation in Mexico begs the question of what traditional roles actually mean for Mexican women. Interviews with women who immigrated to the United States from rural central Mexico revealed that, in their experience, amidst these changing trends, women in rural areas still did not work in the formal sector. They might do domestic work for relatives in order to feed all of the mouths in a family, but upon marriage, they were usually confined to domestic work. In the event that they do get a job, gender relations might begin to shift, as women no longer have to respect, tolerate, or even stay with husbands who spend money on vices and do not treat them with compassion. However, having been to the United States, women are less likely to see the meager wages in Mexico as adequate and empowering. As Angelica points out, I went back to Mexico for a year, but it was awful because I was making $80 at a shoe factory every 15 days, and I could make that in 3 days in the U.S. Thus, especially after having lived in the U.S., wages for women in Mexico can seem more demeaning than empowering. In the age of globalization, women have become the preferred providers of cheap, repetitive, and often poorly paid labor. Rather than providing living wages to Mexican women, these industries only intensify their desire to emigrate. In the immigrant context of South Bend, women we interviewed spoke positively of their factory jobs. Although they find the work to be repetitive and uninspiring, they claim that the job gives them greater freedom because they are economically independent from their husbands. However, they lament the fact that, as it is customary for protective Mexican mothers, they cannot be with their children all day. Nonetheless, it is important to note that there is no all-encompassing trend to describe the female migrant's transition, since there are so many variables in the lives of migrant women. However, based on the interviews conducted for this research, there is considerable evidence that many, though not all, women in the United States and in Mexico have gained a new level of autonomy with the rising trend in immigration. Domestic violence, a male perspective. When asked about their changing gender roles in the U.S., men surveyed had a variety of responses. The heterogeneity of responses reflects the fact that the extent of this change and the attitudes towards it vary tremendously among Mexican males. In concordance with current social science theorizations, masculinity is multidimensional and historically variable. Thus, views on changing masculinity are undoubtedly variable as well. As Matthew Gutman points out in his book, The Meanings of Macho, models of homogeneity among men falsely lead to the notion that there is a unitary man's point of view. Rather, male views change and deviate in a processual flux and cannot be modeled into particular configuration. The following scenarios from our interviews demonstrate this diversity. When asked how their gender roles had changed in the United States, 3 male informants, who were originally married in Mexico, remarked that they could no longer beat their wives in the United States as they did in Mexico for fear of police intervention. As women's agency expands in the United States, men often have even more incentive to abuse them in order to reassert their power in the home. However, fear of legal repercussions forces some immigrant men to shed their macho role of violently demonstrating discontent in the home. According to Victor, in Mexico, the police would come to the door and ask what the problem was, and upon finding out that the woman was disturbing the man, they might tell the man to give her another one in order to shut her up. While his father chimed in, stating that this is changing under Mexico's new president, they both agreed that men had less freedom to physically control their wives in the United States than they did in Mexico. Despite domestic violence laws in the United States, this transformation is certainly not one that always occurs. Some men resist this shift in power and continue beating their wives, often with the knowledge of their wives cannot go to the police because they are undocumented and would jeopardize their entire family's safety in doing so. Additionally, the loss of social networks and the new spatial living situations sometimes make abuse more feasible in the United States, whereas in Mexico, families were more likely to live closer together and to utilize social networks to keep abuse in check. We found that persistence in physical abuse is more common among older men who were first married in Mexico, although it often subsides as women age and can no longer risk the family's honor by having illegitimate children. It is important to note that women can also contribute to gender hierarchies. According to Jocelyn, who suffered abuse at the hands of her husband, some of her friends encouraged her to leave him, while others told her not to overstep her bounds as a woman and to stay with him even though he abused her. Women as well as men can scold other women for daring to challenge gender stereotypes. In some cases, women may even allow their husbands to beat them in exchange for their independence outside of the home. A case study. One man's story illustrates the way in which a man's views on power relations to the home can transform dramatically throughout the course of one's lifetime. Although not all Mexican immigrant men experience this transformation, it is a powerful testament to the possibility for change in gender relations and beliefs that can occur in immigration across space and time. Antonio is a second-generation immigrant, but he grew up with his father's example of how to exert power in the home. Looking back on the power dynamics at play in his upbringing, he recalls, "Mom and Dad got here to the United States, and it was the same stuff for my mom. Why? Because she didn't know how to drive, read, write. So to her, it was the same stuff. It was just working, and that was it. My dad beat her, and that's it. She couldn't do anything. Why? Because she didn't have the knowledge of reading or writing or knowing people that told her she could survive on her own. So for a lot of women, it's the same thing." Growing up, Antonio's concept of what it meant to be a man was predicated on the fact that he had to use physical force to control his wife and children in order to exert his manliness. Additionally, women were to remain isolated in the house so as to not learn to resist the patriarchy inherent in the household. Antonio felt constant pressure to be like his father and followed in his footsteps to the point that he would not allow his own wife to venture outside of the house. When asked if this is the prevailing view of men in Mexico, he responded, "Yeah, in Mexico, it's like the man and the power, and that's it, you know? I'm gonna do this and that, but you don't have no opinion. You're just right here at home so you can cook and take care of the kids, and that's that. Here, it's totally different. Now, I think different, that we're equal, me and her." His description of the macho mentality of some Mexican men fits a common local theory of gender and power in which men portrayed macho behavior as a caricature of masculinity, as men who take and abuse power without earning it by fulfilling their responsibilities. His shift away from this macho mentality came with the strong influence of the Catholic Church. Antonio claims that the church taught him a different meaning of being a man. After wielding power and dominance over his wife for 11 years, he now claims that men and women are equal, and even attests to the strength and resilience of women who have had to work harder than men for years amidst abuse with little recognition. Honestly, now the way I think, the woman is always stronger than the men. Over there and right here. Because honestly, I saw my mom and I see my wife too, but sometimes we say we're the man, but honestly, the woman is more than the man. Because see, like my mom, she used to go to work, come home, and take care of us, cook, clean, the house, and everything. My dad, the only thing that he did is work, and that was it. He just waited till the food was ready. My wife did the same stuff. But now, for example, she goes to work. I clean the whole house. I cook for her. I wash the dishes, the clothes, everything. I take care of the kids, and it doesn't take away from me being a man. Although Antonio has made a rather remarkable transition, he proceeded to explain to us that he is the anomaly rather than the norm, and that he receives quite a bit of criticism from his male peers for his change in behavior and mentality.